December 14th, 1943, Detroit, Michigan. Snow drifted lazily past the windows of the massive Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, where the afternoon shift was just hitting its stride. Inside, the thunder of machinery drowned out everything except the occasional shout of a foreman directing traffic as another Sherman tank rolled off the production line. The 9th one that day. The 63rd that week. 6,000 miles away in Kassel, Germany, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller was signing paperwork authorizing the acceptance of 17 Panzer IV tanks for the entire month, believing these formidable machines would turn the tide on the Eastern Front. Neither man could comprehend the scale of what was happening on the opposite side of the war. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how American industrial might accomplished what no army ever could. It broke the spirit of the Wehrmacht not through superior tactics or bravery, but through an avalanche of steel so overwhelming that it transformed hardened German officers from true believers into men who knew, with mathematical certainty, that their defeat was inevitable. The roar of the assembly line was deafening. Sarah Wilkinson pulled her bandana tighter around her hair and leaned into her work, her welding torch sending sparks cascading across the Sherman tank's hull. 12 hours into her shift at the Detroit tank arsenal, her arms ached, but her pace never slowed. 3 years earlier, she'd been a housewife with 2 children. Now she was one of 42, 00 workers, nearly half of them women, who kept the arsenal running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. "Johnson, tell your crew to pick up the pace," Foreman Miller shouted over the industrial cacophony. "We've got a quota of 15 today." Sarah nodded without looking up. 15 M4 Shermans. Yesterday, it had been 14. Last month, the daily average was 12. The numbers kept climbing, yet somehow they kept meeting them. The Detroit tank arsenal alone was now producing more tanks every 2 weeks than all of Germany's factories combined produced in a month. "Can you believe it?" Frank Kozlowski said during their 5-minute break, sipping coffee that tasted like motor oil. "My cousin just got back from North Africa, says our boys over there have so many tanks they don't know what to do with them all." Sarah nodded, stretching her sore shoulders. "My husband writes from England that they've got warehouses full of them just waiting to cross the channel. Says the limeys can't believe their eyes." Frank chuckled. "My old man fought in the Great War. Said they had to ration bullets. Now we're shipping tanks like they're Christmas cards." The 5-minute whistle blew, sending them back to their stations. Sarah glanced at her watch, a gift from her husband before he shipped out. 7 more hours until the night shift took over. 7 more hours of building weapons she prayed her husband would never need to use. Hauptmann Werner Keller stared in disbelief at the burning hulks that had once been Panzer IVs. Just 3 days into the Allied invasion of Normandy, and already his company had lost 5 irreplaceable tanks. Through his binoculars, he could make out at least a dozen American Shermans advancing toward his position near Caen. "Herr Hauptmann, orders from battalion," his radio operator called out, extending the handset. Keller listened to his commander's instructions, his expression darkening with each word. "We are to hold this position until reinforcements arrive," he told his men after hanging up. "The replacement tanks will reach us within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. His company of 11 tanks, now reduced to 6, was expected to hold back what appeared to be an endless supply of American armor. Even as he organized his defensive position, Keller found himself performing mental calculations. 6 tanks with limited fuel and ammunition, 2 weeks until replacements. Meanwhile, intelligence reported that the Americans were unloading hundreds of tanks daily onto the Normandy beaches. "Herr Hauptmann," Feldwebel Müller approached, saluting crisply. "The men wish to know when we can expect ammunition resupply." Keller kept his face neutral. Soon, Feldwebel. Very soon. And the lie tasted bitter. The truth that each of his tanks had only 20 rounds of main gun ammunition remaining would destroy morale. What the men didn't know, what only commanders like Keller were briefed on, was the catastrophic disparity in production. While German factories struggled to produce 25 tanks per month, American factories were turning out 25 tanks per day. Per factory. The numbers haunted his dreams. Not the casualty figures or kill ratios that officers typically obsessed over, but production numbers. Cold, implacable mathematics that told the true story of the war. As night fell, Keller penned a letter to his wife in Munich. "My dearest Helga, today I witnessed something that I struggle to put into words. When our last engagement ended, we had destroyed 7 American tanks, a victory by any tactical measure. Yet as we withdrew to our new positions, I saw through my binoculars no fewer than 12 fresh tanks rolling forward to replace them. For every one we destroy, they simply send 2 more. The Führer assures us that our superior German engineering will prevail, but I find myself wondering, what good is a tank that can destroy 5 enemy tanks before being knocked out if the enemy can build 50 tanks in the time it takes us to build 1? He stopped writing, suddenly aware of how defeatist his words sounded. Such thoughts, if discovered, could land him in serious trouble. He crumpled the paper and started again with patriotic platitudes about final victory. But the numbers continued to haunt him. Colonel Robert Armstrong walked the immense floor of the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Rapids, Michigan, clipboard in hand, nodding with satisfaction. The former automobile manufacturing facility stretched over 113 acres, with 7 million square feet of production space operating round the clock. In the previous week, they had completed 137 M4 Sherman tanks, a new record. Impressive, isn't it? Edward Hayes, the plant manager, had to shout to be heard over the industrial din. 2 years ago, most of these people had never seen a tank except in newsreels. Now they're building one every 30 minutes. Armstrong nodded, watching as a massive overhead crane swung a Sherman's turret into place. "How many women do you have working here now?" "Nearly 60% of our workforce," Hayes replied with pride. "They're outperforming the men in precision assembly, if I'm being honest. We've got housewives, school teachers, even a former concert pianist running lathes and welding gun mounts." They stopped at a station where a young woman was carefully calibrating the elevation mechanism for a 75-millimeter gun. Her fingers, once manicured, were now calloused and stained with machine oil. "This is Dorothy Miller," Hayes introduced her. "Former secretary, now one of our best ballistic technicians." Armstrong extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Miller. Your work is making a difference overseas." The woman's face brightened. "My brother's with Patton's Third Army. I keep thinking one of these tanks might save his life someday." "It very well might," Armstrong agreed. "Do you know how many tanks you folks are producing compared to the Germans?" "I heard it was a lot more," she replied, "in the time it takes them to build 1 Tiger tank. This factory alone produces over 50 Shermans," Armstrong said, "and we have 7 major tank factories operating across the country." Dorothy's eyes widened. "My brother wrote that the Germans have better tanks than ours." Armstrong nodded. "Better in some ways, yes. Their Tigers and Panthers are more heavily armored, with more powerful guns, but—" He gestured at the production floor, where tanks in various stages of completion stretched as far as the eye could see. "They can't build enough of them, and a superior tank that isn't on the battlefield is just a blueprint." As they continued their tour, Armstrong reflected on the latest intelligence from Europe. German factories were being bombed around the clock, their production disrupted by shortages of everything from steel to rubber to skilled labor. Meanwhile, American factories were hitting their stride, protected by 2 vast oceans and an economy that had fully transitioned to war production. The numbers told the story. Krupp Works in Essen could produce perhaps 15-20 tanks in a good month when not suffering from Allied bombing. The Detroit arsenal was now producing 25 tanks every day. This wasn't just a war of armies anymore. It was Henry Ford versus Krupp, Detroit versus the Ruhr Valley. And despite the vaunted German engineering, American mass production was winning. SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper stood in the railroad yard at Kassel, watching with growing frustration as workers unloaded the latest shipment of tanks from the MAN factory in Nuremberg. 5 Panther tanks. 5, when he had been promised 15. "This is all?" he demanded of the harried logistics officer. "I'm afraid so, Standartenführer," the man replied, consulting his clipboard. "Production difficulties. The factory was hit again last week by American bombers." Peiper suppressed his anger. It would do no good to shoot the messenger, however tempting. His Kampfgruppe was slated to participate in a major counter-offensive in the Ardennes, yet he had barely half the armor he needed. "What about fuel?" he asked. The logistics officer's expression grew even more uncomfortable. 30% of your allocation, sir. There have been difficulties with the synthetic oil plants." Difficulties. The euphemism for disaster. Allied bombing had reduced Germany's fuel production to a trickle. The new tanks he did receive would likely sit idle for lack of fuel to run them. Later, in his office, Peiper reviewed the intelligence reports from captured American officers. The information was both staggering and depressing. The Americans were now producing aviation fuel at a rate of 15 million barrels per month, more than all of Germany's fuel production combined. Their tank factories in Detroit alone covered more square footage than all of Germany's armor production facilities together. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. A junior officer appeared, saluting. "Sir, we've received the latest production figures from High Command." Peiper took the document, scanning it quickly. The Reich's total tank production for October 1943, 267 units across all types. His eye caught a notation at the bottom, estimated American production for the same period, 3, 8 and 60 units. The disparity was no longer just alarming, it was existential. For every tank Germany built, the Americans built 14, and that didn't even account for British and Soviet production. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Peiper said, dismissing the officer. Alone again, he allowed himself a moment of pure, unpolitical thought. How do we win against such overwhelming odds? The official party line, that superior German will and engineering would overcome all obstacles, rang increasingly hollow. Peiper had seen the American Sherman tanks up close. Individually, they were inferior to German Panthers and Tigers, but they never came individually. They came in swarms, accompanied by endless supplies, endless fuel, endless spare parts. The Americans had industrialized warfare in a way that Germany, for all its military prowess, could not match. And Peiper, a shrewd tactician, was beginning to suspect this would be their undoing. Margaret Wilson wiped sweat from her brow as she guided another sheet of armor plate into position. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, was sweltering in the July heat. The massive factory floor a chaos of activity as thousands of workers assembled components for the Sherman tanks that would soon be shipping to Europe. 3-minute warning for shift change," a foreman called out. Margaret quickly finished securing the armor plate, then stepped back to survey her work. This tank, designated M4A3E8, or Easy 8 as the workers called it, would be rolling off the line by tomorrow morning. As she gathered her tools, Margaret noticed a group of men in suits being led through the factory floor. One of them, she realized with a start, was Henry Ford II himself, accompanied by several army officers. "Production is up 22% from last quarter," the plant manager was saying as they passed. "We're now completing a new tank every 53 minutes, 24 hours a day." One of the army officers let out a low whistle. "And how does that compare to German production?" Intelligence reports suggest their largest tank factory at Kassel is producing about 40 tanks per month when it's not being bombed, another officer replied. We're producing more than that every 2 days in this factory alone. Margaret felt a swell of pride as she punched her time card and headed for the changing rooms. Her brother had been killed at Kasserine Pass the previous year, his M3 Lee tank no match for the German panzers he'd encountered. The tanks she helped build now were better, perhaps not as good as the latest German models individually, but they would arrive at the front in overwhelming numbers. In the locker room, she changed quickly and checked her appearance in the small mirror she kept in her bag. Her face was streaked with grease, her hair flattened by the bandana she wore for safety. Not exactly the glamorous war work depicted in recruiting posters, but Margaret felt a deep satisfaction nonetheless. Each rivet she secured, each plate she installed, was one more piece of protection for some American boy far from home. Outside the factory, a small crowd had gathered. A train was being loaded with the latest batch of completed tanks, their olive-drab hulls gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. 87 Shermans, an entire week's production from this one factory, bound for the port of New York and then onward to Europe. 87 tanks, more than all of Germany's factories would produce in the same week. The mathematics of victory were becoming clear to everyone. Oberleutnant Karl Schmidt could not believe his eyes. From his vantage point on the hill above St. Lo, he watched in growing horror as an endless column of American tanks snaked along the Norman roads. Through his binoculars, he counted more than 100 Shermans, accompanied by fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, mobile repair units, and all the other elements of a fully mechanized army on the move. Radio Battalion Headquarters, he ordered his radio man. Report that American armor, estimated strength 100-plus tanks, is advancing along the Saint-Lô-Coutances road. The reply came back minutes later. Hold position. Reinforcements are 3 days away. Delay enemy advance by all means. Schmidt lowered the radio handset slowly, the impossibility of his orders sinking in. His company had 4 Panzer IV remaining, with fuel for perhaps 50 kilometers each and ammunition that would be exhausted after a single engagement. They were being asked to stop a force 25 times their size. Yet Schmidt was a good officer who followed orders. He positioned his tanks carefully, using the hedgerows for cover, hoping to ambush the lead elements of the American column. The engagement was brief and brutal. Schmidt's tanks managed to knock out 7 Shermans before being spotted. American artillery zeroed in on their positions within minutes, followed by an overwhelming armored assault. 3 of Schmidt's 4 tanks were destroyed. Only his own, backing away under smoke cover, managed to escape. As he retreated toward a secondary position, Schmidt observed something that chilled him more than the battle itself. American recovery vehicles were already hooking up to the damaged Shermans. Within hours, those tanks would be back in action, repaired by mobile workshops that followed just behind the front lines. His own destroyed panzers would become battlefield monuments, impossible to recover or replace. That evening, Schmidt was summoned to divisional headquarters, a farmhouse 10 kilometers behind the front. There, he found a group of officers gathered around a map, their faces grim. Oberleutnant Schmidt, Colonel Richter acknowledged him. Your report was most valuable. Tell us exactly what you observed of the American armor. Schmidt recounted the size and composition of the enemy force, the efficiency of their recovery operations, the seemingly endless supply of fuel and ammunition. When he finished, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, General Weber spoke. Gentlemen, I have just received the latest intelligence assessment from Berlin. American factories are now producing over 2 Zero tanks per month. Their primary tank plant in Detroit manufactures more tanks every week than all of our factories combined produce in a month. The officers exchanged glances, the implications clear. We are still expected to hold Normandy? a major asked. "Those are our orders," Weber replied, his tone making it clear that he harbored his own doubts. As the meeting continued, Schmidt found himself thinking not of tactics or strategy, but of factories. Massive American factories where workers who never saw combat, never experienced bombing raids, calmly assembled the machines that were grinding down the Wehrmacht tank by tank. For the first time, he began to doubt the constant propaganda about German technological superiority. What good was a Tiger tank that could destroy 10 Shermans before succumbing if the Americans simply built 15 more? The cold equations of industrial production were rendering courage, skill, and even superior engineering irrelevant. Frank Thompson guided his crane with practiced precision, lowering a Sherman's engine into its compartment where a team of workers waited to secure it. The Cadillac tank plant in Cleveland had been converted from automobile production in just 6 months and was now producing components for 3 different factories. "Thompson!" his supervisor called. "Got a special visitor who wants to see your operation. This is Lieutenant Miller, just back from Europe." Frank nodded to the young officer, noting the Purple Heart on his uniform. "Welcome to Cleveland, Lieutenant. What can I do for you?" "Just wanted to see where our tanks are born," Miller replied, looking around with obvious interest. "I commanded a Sherman in Patton's Third Army, went through France and into Germany." Frank continued working as they talked, the rhythm of the factory floor uninterrupted. "How'd our tanks hold up?" Miller's expression was complex. "Honestly, one-on-one, the German Tigers and Panthers had us beat. Better armor, better gun. But," he gestured at the production line, "we always had more, way more. If we lost 5 tanks taking out 1 Tiger, there were 10 more Shermans right behind us. The Germans had nothing in reserve." Frank nodded as he swung another engine into place. His own son was in the Pacific, a Marine fighting the Japanese. No tanks there, but the same principle applied. American industry was simply outproducing the Axis on every front, in every category. "Had a German officer prisoner tell me something I'll never forget," Miller continued. "Said he knew they'd lose the war the day he saw his first American supply depot. Said there were more trucks in that one place than in the entire German army. More food, more fuel, more ammunition than he thought existed in the world." Frank thought about that as he completed his shift. The numbers were staggering. The Detroit tank arsenal alone covered 113 acres and employed over 40 Zuerzeron workers. It had produced more than 22 Zuerzeron tanks since 1941, each one rolling off the assembly line every 30 minutes like clockwork. After work, Frank joined some colleagues at a local bar. The conversation inevitably turned to the war, now in its final stages in Europe. "Heard something interesting on the radio today," Jake Sullivan, another crane operator, mentioned. "Some captured German general said the biggest shock when fighting Americans wasn't our tactics or our bravery, but our abundance. Said they couldn't believe each of our soldiers had their own weapon, their own equipment, all standardized, all top quality." "Makes sense," Frank replied. "Remember before the war when we were making cars? Old Henry Ford figured out how to make complicated machines simple enough that regular people could build them by the millions. The Germans might make better machines, but we make more of them. A lot more." "My cousin works at the Dodge factory in Detroit," another worker chimed in. "Says they're making 500 trucks a month now, 5,000, and that's just one factory." The numbers told the story of the war more eloquently than any speech or newspaper headline. American factories were outproducing the entire Axis, combined by ratios that made ultimate victory not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, sat at his desk in Berlin, reviewing the latest production reports with growing despair. February 1945, and the Reich's tank production had fallen to 167 units for the month. Bombing, fuel shortages, raw material shortages, transportation disruptions, all were taking their toll. Across his desk sat Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, looking equally grim. The Americans produced 854 tanks in January, Speer said quietly. The British another 320. The Soviets approximately 400. Guderian didn't respond immediately. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. For every tank Germany now produced, the Allies produced more than 20. We've increased production efficiency by 40% since 1943, Speer continued, a note of bitter pride in his voice. German workers are performing miracles in factories that are being bombed daily. But it is not enough, Guderian finished for him. It could never be enough. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of air raid sirens. Another bombing raid was approaching Berlin. Neither man moved toward the shelters. They had become almost immune to the constant alerts. "Do you know what an American prisoner told me last month?" Guderian asked as the anti-aircraft guns began firing in the distance. "He said they have so many tanks in reserve that entire divisions are being re-equipped with brand new vehicles simply because the newer models are marginally better than the ones they were already using. Perfectly good tanks, hundreds of them, set aside because something slightly better had come off the assembly line." Speer nodded sadly. "I've seen the intelligence reports. Their Detroit arsenal employs more workers than all of our tank factories combined, and it's just one of many." The conversation died as the first bombs began falling, the building shuddering with each impact. It was the third raid that week, and it was only Wednesday. 3 days later, Guderian stood in the ruins of the Alket tank factory in Berlin. The facility, which had once produced 25 tanks per month, was now a shattered skeleton of twisted metal and collapsed concrete. Workers were already clearing debris, preparing to resume production in whatever spaces remained usable. "How long until you can restart production?" he asked the factory manager. 3 weeks, Herr Generaloberst, if we can get the materials. The main assembly line is destroyed, but we can improvise." Guderian nodded, knowing that "if we can get the materials" was an increasingly substantial caveat. Rail lines were cut daily by Allied bombing, coal shipments were intercepted, steel allocations were diverted to more immediate needs. A week later, he was summoned to the Führer bunker in Berlin to brief Hitler on the armored situation. The underground complex was a far cry from the Grand Chancellery, where such meetings had been held earlier in the war. Hitler, looking increasingly unwell, pored over the production reports Guderian had brought. "These numbers cannot be correct," he insisted, jabbing at the Allied production estimates. "German intelligence is being deceived. It is not possible for factories to produce so many tanks." "Mein Führer, we have multiple confirmation sources, including aerial reconnaissance of their factories and shipping yards. The Americans alone are producing over 2 Rosen tanks every month. Their primary factories operate 24 hours per day without interruption from bombing." Hitler dismissed this with a wave of his trembling hand. "Then we must accelerate our own production. The new Tiger II will change the equation. 1 Tiger II can destroy 10 Shermans." Guderian chose his next words carefully. "Even if that is true, mein Führer, the Americans can build 20 Shermans in the time it takes us to build 1 Tiger II. And they have the fuel to operate all of them, while many of our tanks sit idle." The meeting deteriorated after that, with Hitler insisting that new wonder weapons would soon reverse Germany's fortunes. Guderian left the bunker knowing that the Reich was not just being defeated militarily, but had already lost the industrial war that underpinned the conflict. 1 month before Germany's surrender, Guderian penned a confidential assessment for the historical record. The war was lost, not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. American industrial capacity, safely beyond the reach of our bombers, simply overwhelmed us. While we expended enormous resources designing incrementally better tanks, they built good enough tanks in quantities we could never match. The mathematics of production, not the valor of soldiers, determined the outcome. Sarah Wilkinson watched as the last Sherman tank rolled off the assembly line at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. It was May 7th, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Production had already been scaling down for months as victory in Europe became inevitable, but this tank, ceremonially numbered 22-234, marked the official end of the Arsenal's wartime production. "Hard to believe it's over," Frank Kozlowski said, standing beside her. 3 years of working ourselves to the bone, and just like that, it's done. Sarah nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, relief that the killing was ending, uncertainty about what came next. Already, management had announced plans to convert portions of the facility back to civilian production. As part of the day's ceremony, an army officer addressed the assembled workers. "What you accomplished here was nothing short of miraculous," Colonel James Harrison told them. "This single factory produced more tanks than all of Germany's factories combined in the last year of the war." When historians look back at why the Allies won, they'll point to places like this, not just the frontline soldiers, but the production lines that made victory possible. He went on to share intelligence reports that had been declassified now that the war was ending. Captured German officers have told us that nothing broke their morale more completely than discovering the scale of American production. One panzer commander said that after losing tanks in battle, they would wait weeks or months for replacements. Meanwhile, American units would have fresh tanks the very next day. After the ceremony, Sarah returned home to find a telegram waiting. Her husband John was coming home, wounded but alive. As she sat on their front porch, she found herself reflecting on the strange reality that she, a former housewife who had never fired a gun in anger, had perhaps contributed more to winning the war than many soldiers. The sheer mathematics of American production had been overwhelming. At peak capacity, American factories had produced 500 tanks per month, compared to Germany's 250. One Detroit factory could outproduce the entire Third Reich. The Germans, for all their vaunted engineering and discipline, had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern war. They had built tanks designed to win battles. The Americans had built an industrial system designed to win wars. A week later, Sarah received a letter from a lieutenant in her husband's unit. "Dear Mrs. Wilkinson, I wanted to personally thank you and all the other workers at the Arsenal. Your husband told me you worked on the Sherman tanks, and I thought you should know that it was one of those tanks that saved our lives in Germany. We were pinned down by a German Tiger, a monster of a tank that our shells just bounced off, but there were 5 of us and only 1 of him. We kept coming from different directions until we finally got a lucky shot. Later, we captured the German tank commander, and I'll never forget what he said. Your tanks are like locusts. We kill 10 and 20 more appear. How can we fight such numbers? That's when I knew we would win. Not because we were braver or better, but because back home, people like you never stop building." Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it in her keepsake box. The war that had begun with Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, had ended in a contest of production capacity that Germany could never have won. American factories had built more tanks in a week than Germany could build in a month, and that mathematical reality had proven more powerful than any military strategy. 2 years after the war, a German tank commander named Werner Keller visited Detroit as part of an industrial exchange program. Standing on the floor of the reconverted tank arsenal, now producing Cadillacs for American consumers, he was still awed by its sheer scale. "We never understood," he confessed to his American guide, Our intelligence told us about your production numbers, but we couldn't grasp what they meant. We thought in terms of divisions and corps, tactics and strategy, but you had transformed war into an industrial process, and we were simply outproduced. Pointing to the assembly line, he continued, Hitler once said that America was a nation of car makers, not warriors. He meant it as an insult, but in the end, your car makers defeated our warriors simply by building more tanks than we could ever destroy. The American nodded. Henry Ford once said that before he made cars, the typical American couldn't afford one. By figuring out mass production, he made them affordable for everyone. We did the same thing with tanks in the war. We made so many that every soldier could have one, while yours had to share. The former enemies shook hands, both understanding the lesson of the conflict. Modern war was not just a test of valor or tactics, but of industrial capacity, and in that contest, America's ability to build more tanks in a week than Germany could build in a month had made the outcome inevitable long before the last shot was fired. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.